Everyone heard the warning. Headlines screamed it. Economists repeated it. Investors panicked over it. China's economy is collapsing. But here's the thing, nobody actually listened to what was being said. They heard collapse and stopped paying attention to the details. And those details? They tell a completely different story. A story that's actually more important, more complex, and honestly, more terrifying than a simple economic collapse. Let me take you back to 2023. Evergrande, China's second largest property developer, defaulted on over $300 billion in debt. Western media went into overdrive. This is China's Lehman moment. The Chinese real estate bubble is finally bursting. The entire economy is coming down. Investors dumped Chinese stocks. Analysts predicted financial contagion spreading globally. Everyone was certain they were watching the beginning of the end. Except that's not what happened. Not even close. And if you actually read what the serious China economists were saying, not the headlines but the actual analysis, they were warning about something completely different. Something that Western media completely misunderstood. And that misunderstanding might be one of the most costly mistakes in modern financial analysis. Here's what they actually said, and I'm going to quote directly from reports that got completely misinterpreted. China is experiencing a deliberate economic transformation that will cause short-term pain but is designed to restructure the economy towards sustainability. Notice something? That's not a warning about collapse. That's a description of controlled demolition. But all anyone heard was pain and restructuring and assumed it meant disaster. Michael Pettis, the economist at Peking University who's been studying China for decades, wrote something fascinating in 2023. He said China's real estate sector needed to shrink from representing 30% of GDP to maybe 15%. He said this would be painful, would reduce growth rates, would cause defaults, but was economically necessary and ultimately healthy. Western media took that analysis and ran headlines like, "Economist predicts Chinese economic crisis." They completely missed the word necessary. Let me explain what's actually happening, because once you understand it, the whole narrative falls apart. China built too much, way too much. Empty apartments, unused infrastructure, cities with capacity for millions but populations in thousands. This was economically inefficient and environmentally unsustainable. Everyone knew this, including the Chinese government, so they made a choice: deflate the bubble in a controlled way rather than let it burst catastrophically. Think about what that means. They intentionally slowed the real estate sector. They let over-leveraged developers fail. They implemented regulations that reduced speculative investment. They shifted financing away from property development toward manufacturing and technology. This wasn't economic collapse, it was economic surgery. Painful, yes. Controlled, absolutely. But here's where Western analysts completely misread the situation. They assumed that because real estate was such a huge part of China's economy, its decline would trigger systemic collapse. They applied Western economic logic to a fundamentally different system. In the West, when a sector that large fails, it triggers cascading defaults, credit freezes, and financial panic. They expected the same in China. What actually happened? The Chinese government absorbed the losses. They moved debt around within the state system. They protected homebuyers while letting investors and developers take losses. They maintained financial stability through direct intervention. They did exactly what a government with control over its financial system can do, but Western governments cannot. They managed a crisis through administrative power rather than market mechanisms. Let me give you specific numbers that blow apart the collapse narrative. In 2023, when Western media was screaming about imminent collapse, China's economy grew 5.2%. In 2024, it grew around 5%. Meanwhile, Germany had negative growth. The UK barely grew. The US managed 2%. So the collapsing economy was growing faster than the healthy Western economies. How does that make sense? It doesn't. Unless the entire narrative is wrong. Unless what looks like collapse is actually transformation. Unless short-term pain is being accepted for long-term restructuring. Unless China is playing a completely different game than Western analysts understand. Here's what serious analysts were actually warning about, and this is where it gets really important. They weren't warning that China would collapse. They were warning that China was restructuring its economy in ways that would make it more competitive, more sustainable, and more independent from Western systems. That's not a collapse warning, that's a competition warning. And we completely missed it. Anne Stevenson Yang, who runs J Capital Research and is deeply critical of many Chinese economic practices, wrote something in 2022 that got totally misinterpreted. She said China's property bubble bursting would force economic restructuring toward manufacturing and exports. Western media presented this as pessimistic, but read it again. Forcing restructuring toward manufacturing and exports means China becoming more competitive in the sectors that actually matter for global economic power. Or look at what Logan Wright from the Rhodium Group said. He warned that China's deleveraging of the property sector would reduce GDP growth from 8% to 4 or 5%, but would make the economy more resilient and less dependent on unsustainable debt. Again, Western media heard reduce growth and wrote collapse stories. They completely ignored more resilient and less dependent on debt. Here's the thing that drives me crazy. Every warning about China's economy came with caveats and context that completely changed the meaning. But headlines don't do nuance. Social media doesn't do context. So, China is restructuring away from real estate toward advanced manufacturing becomes China's economy is collapsing. And everyone believed the simplified version. Let me show you how this played out in real time. In 2023, youth unemployment in China spiked to over 20%. Western media had a field day. China's economy is failing its young people. Social unrest is coming. This proves the model doesn't work. Politicians cited it as evidence that authoritarian capitalism was failing. But here's what actually happened. China had just shut down the private education industry, the real estate sector was contracting, and tech companies were being regulated. Millions of jobs in these sectors disappeared. Youth unemployment spiked because the economy was being restructured. It was a feature of the transition, not a bug in the system. And what did China do? They didn't panic. They didn't reverse course. They implemented massive training programs, created incentives for manufacturing employment, and pushed young people toward sectors they wanted to grow: semiconductors, renewable energy, advanced machinery, artificial intelligence. By late 2024, youth unemployment was dropping as the restructuring progressed. This is what Western analysts missed. China was willing to accept short-term pain, including politically sensitive issues like youth unemployment, to achieve structural change. Western governments can't do this. The moment unemployment rises, there's political pressure to reverse course. China just kept going. Because they're optimizing for different goals on different timelines. Here's a specific example that illustrates everything. The semiconductor industry. When the U.S. banned exports of advanced chip-making equipment to China, Western analysts predicted this would cripple Chinese tech development. China is 10 years behind and can't catch up. The ban will prevent China from advancing. This is an economic and strategic victory. But what were serious China analysts actually saying? They were warning that the ban would force China to develop a completely independent semiconductor supply chain, that it would accelerate domestic innovation, that it would create a parallel tech ecosystem, that within 5 to 10 years, China might have its own advanced chip manufacturing capability, making the ban irrelevant. And what's happening? Huawei released phones with 7-nanometer chips that Western experts said China couldn't make. CIMIC is advancing faster than expected. Chinese companies are developing alternatives to every stage of chip production. The ban didn't stop China, it motivated them. But all Western media reported was, China struggles under U.S. tech restrictions. They completely missed that struggle was producing capability. Let me talk about something that really reveals the misunderstanding: capital outflows. In 2022 and 2023, massive amounts of capital left China. Western media presented this as investors fleeing a sinking ship. Smart money is getting out. This proves the economy is in trouble. Capital flight shows loss of confidence. But look at where the money went and who was moving it. Foreign investors were pulling out, yes, but Chinese companies and individuals were investing overseas as part of deliberate internationalization strategies. The government was actually facilitating some outflows to reduce pressure on the yuan and promote Belt and Road investments. This wasn't panic flight, it was strategic capital deployment. Moreover, the outflows were largely in portfolio investment, the hot money that moves quickly. Foreign direct investment, the money that builds factories and creates long-term commitments, remained relatively stable. But Western media didn't distinguish between types of capital flows. All outflows became evidence of economic distress. Here's what really gets me. The warnings about China weren't about collapse. They were about something much more significant. China deliberately choosing a different economic model and being willing to pay the costs of transition. Western economists were warning that China was decoupling from the Western-led global economy, building independent systems, and restructuring towards self-sufficiency and strategic competition. But that warning got translated into China's economy is failing because that's what Western audiences wanted to hear. It's comforting to think your rival is collapsing. It's terrifying to think they're restructuring to compete more effectively. So we collectively chose to believe the comforting narrative and ignored the terrifying one. Let me give you another example. Local government debt. This is real and serious. Chinese local governments accumulated enormous debts through financing vehicles tied to land sales. As real estate contracted, these debts became problematic. Western analysts called this a ticking time bomb that would explode and bring down the financial system. But what actually happened? The central government started a multi-year program to restructure local government debt, moving it onto central government books, extending repayment timelines, and basically using the state's balance sheet to absorb the problem. Is this economically efficient? No. Does it create moral hazard? Sure. Does it prevent financial crisis? Absolutely. Western economists criticized this as kicking the can down the road and avoiding necessary reforms. But they missed the point. China has the capacity to kick the can indefinitely because the debt is mostly internal and denominated in yuan. They're not Greece owing euros to Germany. They're the Chinese government owing yuan to Chinese banks that the government ultimately controls. It's a fundamentally different situation. Here's something that really illustrates the misunderstanding. The stock market. Chinese stocks got hammered in 2022 and 2023. Western media presented this as reflecting economic fundamentals, proof that the economy was failing. Investors fled, analysts downgraded. But Chinese stocks don't reflect economic fundamentals the way Western stocks do. The Chinese stock market is largely retail-driven, sentiment-based, and disconnected from underlying economic performance. The economy can grow while stocks fall and vice versa. Serious China analysts know this. But Western media kept reporting stock declines as economic indicators. Meanwhile, what was actually happening in the real economy? Manufacturing output increasing, exports hitting records, technology companies launching innovative products, infrastructure projects completing, renewable energy capacity expanding. But none of that mattered because the stock market was down. Let me talk about demographics, because this is another area where warnings got completely misinterpreted. China's population is shrinking and aging. This is fact. Economists warned this would create enormous challenges for economic growth, social services, and competitiveness. Western media heard challenges and wrote disaster. But what were the serious analysts actually saying? They were warning that China was responding to demographic decline by massively investing in automation, artificial intelligence, and productivity-enhancing technology. That they were restructuring the economy to need fewer workers. That they were building elder care systems at scale. That they were preparing for demographic transition in ways Western countries aren't. The warning was, China is adapting to demographic decline, and their responses might make them more competitive, not less. But that got reported as, China's demographic collapse will destroy the economy. Totally different meanings. Here's a specific case study in mishearing warnings. The property sector bailout that everyone expected but didn't happen the way they thought. Western analysts predicted China would have to do a massive bailout like the US did in 2008, flooding the system with money, bailing out failed companies, protecting investors. China did something completely different. They protected home buyers, ensuring apartments got finished and delivered, but they let developers fail. They let investors lose money. They let the sector shrink. They used state resources selectively to prevent social instability, but not to preserve the inflated sector. This was actually more disciplined than Western bailouts, but it got reported as inadequate response to crisis. What serious analysts were saying, China is prioritizing social stability over financial returns, protecting ordinary people over investors, willing to accept sector contraction for long-term health. What media reported, China's inadequate response to property crisis shows economic mismanagement. Let me hit you with something that really bothers me, the deliberate misinterpretation of deflation warnings. Economists noted that China was experiencing deflationary pressure, where prices were stagnant or falling. In the West, deflation is terrifying because it can create debt spirals and economic stagnation. So warnings about Chinese deflation were presented as economic crisis alerts. But China's deflation was different. It was largely driven by industrial overcapacity, meaning they could produce more than domestic demand required. In a Western economy, this would be a problem. In China's export-driven model, it's actually a competitive advantage. They can produce goods more cheaply than anyone else, undercutting global competition. Moreover, the Chinese government has tools to manage deflation that Western governments don't. They can mandate wage increases, increase government spending, direct bank lending, and literally order state enterprises to invest. Deflation is a problem when you can't fight it. China can fight it whenever they choose to. So warnings about deflation were actually observations that China had excess productive capacity that could be deployed for exports and strategic purposes. But this got reported as China faces dangerous deflation. Same words, completely different implications. Here's what I think really happened with all these warnings. Western economists were describing a complex economic transition with risks and opportunities, short-term costs and potential long-term benefits, challenges that required management but weren't existential threats. And all of that nuance got compressed into China's economy is collapsing, because that's a simpler, more dramatic, more clickable narrative. But the cost of this misunderstanding is enormous. Western investors pulled out of Chinese markets based on incomplete understanding, missing potential opportunities. Western policymakers made decisions based on assumptions of Chinese weakness that might not be accurate. Western companies adjusted strategies based on narratives that didn't match reality. Meanwhile, China just kept executing their plan, restructuring the economy, building manufacturing capacity, advancing technology, expanding infrastructure, increasing exports. And when the dust settles, they might emerge with a more balanced, more competitive, more sustainable economy than what they started with. Let me give you a prediction. 5 years from now, we're going to look back at 2022 through 2024 and realize it wasn't China's collapse, it was China's transformation. The real estate bubble deflation that everyone feared would trigger financial crisis will be seen as successful economic surgery. The growth slowdown that seemed like stagnation will be understood as necessary restructuring. The capital outflows that looked like flight will be recognized as internationalization. And the warnings that everyone misheard? They'll be revealed for what they actually were. Observations that China was willing to endure short-term economic pain to achieve long-term strategic goals. That they were restructuring toward advanced manufacturing and technology. That they were building economic resilience and independence. That they were preparing for long-term competition. That's not a collapse warning, that's a competition warning. And we completely missed it because we wanted to hear that China was failing. We needed to believe that our economic model was superior and their model was doomed. So we heard what we wanted to hear and ignored what was actually being said. Here's the really scary part. While we were congratulating ourselves on China's supposed collapse, they were actually getting stronger in the ways that matter. Manufacturing capacity increasing, technology advancing, supply chains securing, export competitiveness improving, strategic industries developing, and we missed all of it because we were too busy celebrating their real estate problems. This is what happens when you mishear warnings, when you let ideology and wishful thinking override careful analysis, when you choose comfortable narratives over uncomfortable realities. We heard collapse and stopped listening, and what we missed might end up being the most important economic story of the decade. The real warning about China wasn't about collapse. It was about transformation, adaptation, and long-term strategic competition. But nobody heard it. We were all too busy listening for what we wanted to hear. And that might be the most expensive mistake we ever made.